Have you ever spent your whole life building a home, only to wake up one morning and realize someone else had quietly taken your place inside it? Have you ever stayed silent because you loved your family, even while they slowly forgot whose house they were living in? And what would you do if the people you welcomed with open arms suddenly expected you to start paying for the privilege of living in your own home? My name is Margaret. I am 70 years old, and until last spring, I believed that kindness always came back to you. I learned that kindness without boundaries can slowly become permission. My husband and I bought our little house 38 years ago. We painted every wall together. We planted every flower in the front yard together. We raised our only son there. Every Christmas, every birthday, and every family celebration happened under that roof. Even after my husband passed away, I never thought about leaving. Every room still held a piece of our life together. 2 years later, my son and his wife asked if they could move in for a while. They wanted to save money before buying a home of their own. I never hesitated. Stay as long as you need, I told them. This house is always open to family. Looking back now, I often wonder if those words were the moment everything began to change. At first, living together felt easy. My daughter-in-law cooked dinner some evenings. My son helped around the yard on weekends. We laughed together and shared quiet mornings over coffee. I truly believed we were helping each other through different seasons of life. Then the small changes started. My favorite reading chair disappeared because it supposedly made the living room feel crowded. The family photographs in the hallway were replaced with decorations that looked more modern. My kitchen cupboards were rearranged because they worked better for someone else. Every change sounded reasonable. Every explanation came with a smile. So I stayed quiet. I told myself families grow and traditions change. But little by little, I stopped feeling like the woman who owned the house. When visitors came over, my daughter-in-law greeted them before I reached the front door. She decided where everyone would sit. She planned family dinners without asking me. More and more, I found myself asking permission inside a home that had once been entirely mine. I wanted peace more than I wanted to be right, so I ignored the uncomfortable feeling growing inside me. Then one Tuesday morning, I walked into the kitchen and found a white envelope resting neatly beside my coffee mug. My name was typed across the front, not written by hand. Typed. I frowned and opened it, expecting another bank letter or an insurance notice. Instead, I found several printed pages clipped together. The title across the top made my hand stop moving. Rental contribution agreement. Before I could finish reading, my daughter-in-law walked into the kitchen carrying her phone. She smiled as casually as if we were discussing the grocery list. "Good," she said. "You found it." I looked from the papers to her face, certain there had to be some mistake. She sat down across from me as calmly as ever. "My mom has been struggling financially," she explained. "We've been helping her every month, and money has been getting tight. Since we're all living together, it only seems fair that everyone contributes." She gently slid the papers a little closer to me, smiling as though she expected me to thank her for thinking of everything. "Starting next month, you'll pay rent for your room. It'll help support the household and my mom." I searched her face for the smallest hint that she was joking. I couldn't find one. For several long seconds, the kitchen felt strangely quiet. Then I carefully folded the papers, slipped them back into the envelope, placed it on the table between us, and said nothing at all. I carried the envelope upstairs without another word. Behind me, I could hear my daughter-in-law moving around the kitchen as though nothing unusual had happened. She didn't follow me. She didn't apologize. She seemed completely certain I would read the agreement, sign it, and life would continue exactly as before. I closed my bedroom door and sat quietly on the edge of my bed. For a long time, I simply stared at the papers resting in my lap. My name appeared beside empty spaces, waiting for my signature. There was even a monthly payment listed at the bottom. It wasn't the amount that hurt. It was what that number meant. Somehow, after 38 years in the home my husband and I had built together, I had become someone expected to pay for the right to sleep in my own bedroom. I kept asking myself if I had misunderstood something. Maybe they wanted help with bills and had simply chosen the worst possible way to ask. Maybe this was nothing more than a thoughtless mistake. I wanted to believe that because the alternative was far more painful. Later that evening, my son came home from work. I waited for him to mention the envelope. He didn't. We sat through dinner talking about the weather in his office as though nothing had changed. Finally, I looked at him and quietly asked, "Did you know about the agreement on the kitchen table?" He stopped eating for a second before lowering his eyes. "Yeah," he answered softly. "We talked about it last week." I felt something sink inside me. "And you thought it was fair?" I asked. He rubbed the back of his neck and let out a slow breath. "Mom, we just thought everyone living here should contribute." I studied his face, hoping he would smile and tell me he had changed his mind. He never did. Before I could answer, my daughter-in-law walked into the dining room carrying a folder. She placed it beside my plate without saying a word. Inside were printed receipts, a payment schedule, and a note showing exactly how much money would be sent to her mother every month. Everything had already been planned. Everything had already been decided. No one had asked what I thought. No one had even considered that they were asking the owner of the house to become a tenant inside it. I slowly closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. My daughter-in-law smiled politely. "We just thought this was the easiest solution for everyone," she said. I looked at my son one last time, waiting for him to say something different. Instead, he quietly nodded. In that moment, I realized the rent had never really been about money. It was about something much harder to accept. Somewhere along the way, they had stopped seeing me as the woman who owned the house. They had started seeing me as just another person living under their rules. Later that night, after the house had fallen silent, I stood alone in my bedroom. My eyes drifted across the walls my husband and I had painted together so many years before. Every corner held a memory of the life we had built. Yet for the first time in 38 years, I didn't feel safe inside my own home. That was when I picked up my phone, found a number I hadn't called in years, and quietly made an appointment for the following morning. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. The next morning, I left the house before anyone else was awake. I didn't slam the front door. I didn't leave a note. I simply picked up my purse, climbed into my car, and drove across town to the attorney who had helped my husband and me write our wills many years earlier. When I walked into his office, he smiled warmly and said, "Margaret, it's been a long time." I smiled back, but it didn't reach my eyes. After listening quietly to everything that had happened, He opened my file and looked at me for a long moment. "The house is still entirely in your name," he said. "Nothing has changed." Hearing those words should have brought me comfort. Instead, they broke my heart. My family had asked me to pay rent for a house that legally, financially, and emotionally had never stopped being mine. "What would you like to do?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window and thought about my husband spending weekends fixing the porch, painting the fence, and planting flowers because he always said a home deserved to be cared for. Then I quietly said, "I want my house back." He nodded without asking another question. By that afternoon, every legal paper I needed had been prepared. On my way home, I stopped at a locksmith shop. An hour later, I stood on my front porch as the old lock clicked one final time before dropping into the locksmith's toolbox with a dull metal sound. I watched the new lock slide into place and realized I wasn't locking my family out. I was finally protecting the home my husband and I had spent 38 years building together. When the work was finished, the locksmith handed me 3 new keys. I slipped one into my purse and placed the other 2 in a small kitchen drawer. There would be no spare key hidden outside anymore. Then I walked through every room one last time. In the hallway, I paused beneath the pencil marks on the wall where we'd measured my son's height every birthday until he left for college. I traced the faded lines with my fingertips, remembering how excited he'd been each year to see if he'd finally grown taller than his father. I rested my hand there for one last moment before walking on. Then I packed only the things that truly belonged to me. My husband's framed photograph, our wedding album, his old coffee mug that still sat in the cabinet exactly where he had left it, a few clothes, a few family keepsakes. Everything else stayed exactly where it was. Before leaving, I wrote a short note and placed it on the kitchen table where the rental agreement had been waiting for me the day before. It read, "A tenant pays rent. An owner decides who lives in the house. We'll speak soon." I locked the front door behind me and drove to a small hotel across town. Late that afternoon, my phone began ringing. First my daughter-in-law, then my son, then both of them again. I watched every call appear on the screen without answering. A few minutes later, the text messages started. "Mom, where are you? Why won't the front door open? Did something happen?" I read every message in silence. Then one final message appeared. It was from my son. "Mom, did you change the locks?" I looked at the screen for several seconds before setting the phone back on the bedside table. For the first time in years, the key in my son's pocket no longer opened my front door. The next knock wouldn't be from family returning home. It would be from people asking for permission to come back inside. The knock came the following afternoon. Slow, careful, almost uncertain. I already knew who it was before I looked through the window beside the front door. My son stood on the porch with my daughter-in-law beside him. Neither of them looked the way they had the morning they handed me the rental agreement. My son's shoulders were slumped. My daughter-in-law kept twisting her hands together without realizing it. I opened the door, but I didn't step aside. For several long seconds, none of us spoke. Finally, my son broke the silence. "Mom, can we come in?" he asked quietly. I looked at the new lock for a brief moment before meeting his eyes again. "You can come in," I said, "as guests." Neither of them argued. They quietly followed me into the living room and sat exactly where I invited them to sit. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument could have. My son looked around the room, before speaking again. "The utility company called this morning," he admitted. "Then the insurance office. They kept asking for you. That's when I realized every account was still in your name. Didn't know you were paying for everything." I said nothing. He swallowed hard before continuing. "I always thought we were helping you keep the house running." I gently shook my head. "The mortgage was paid off years ago," I replied. "But every property tax bill, every insurance payment, every repair, every broken appliance, every service call, I paid for all of it, even after both of you moved in." My daughter-in-law slowly lowered her eyes. My son looked genuinely confused. "I never saw any of the bills," he whispered. "No," I answered calmly, "because I never wanted you to worry about them." The room became quiet again. Then my daughter-in-law finally spoke. Her voice sounded very different from the confident tone she had used in the kitchen. "I thought, since we were all living together, everyone should share the costs." I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You weren't asking everyone to share the costs," I said quietly. "You were asking the woman who had already been paying for everything to start paying rent in her own house." She didn't respond. There was nothing she could say. My son slowly leaned forward and covered his face with both hands. When he finally looked up again, his eyes were filled with regret. "Then one day," he said softly, "it stopped feeling like we were borrowing your home for a while. I let us start acting as though it belonged to all of us." His words hung in the room. No one interrupted them. After another long silence, he reached into his pocket and placed the old brass key on the coffee table. Between us, neither of us touched it. We simply looked at it. My husband had given that key to our son years earlier for emergencies. Somewhere along the way, an emergency key had quietly become an everyday key. I slowly looked at it before raising my eyes to my son. "Keep it," I said. He looked at me in surprise. "It doesn't open anything anymore." Another long silence settled over the room. Finally, my son looked towards the family photograph resting on the bookshelf, the one of his father smiling in front of the house they had built together. His voice almost disappeared. When he spoke again, "Dad always taught me to respect this home," he whispered. "I don't think he'd recognize the way I treated you." No one answered. We simply sat there while the little brass key rested between us. Hours earlier, it had been nothing more than a spare key. Now it rested between us like a quiet reminder that a door can always be unlocked, but trust has to be invited back inside. And as we sat there in silence, I realized something else. Changing the locks had been the easy part. Deciding whether I could ever trust them again would be much harder. A week passed before I heard from them again. This time, there were no demands, no excuses, and no carefully prepared plans waiting for me on the kitchen table. My son called only once. "Mom," he said quietly, "we know we don't deserve another chance, but if you're willing, we'd like to see you." I thought about it for 2 days before agreeing. When they arrived, they didn't come inside until I opened the door and invited them. That small pause told me more than any apology could have. For the first time in a long while, they understood that this was still my home. My daughter-in-law was the first to speak. She held a small envelope in her hands, but she didn't offer it to me right away. "I owe you an apology," she said softly. "The day I printed that rental agreement, my mother told me it made sense because everyone living in a house should help pay for it. I never stopped to ask myself one simple question: whose house it really was. I was so busy trying to solve one problem that I created a much bigger one. She looked down for a moment before continuing. I didn't just ask you for rent. I made you feel like you no longer belonged in the home you built. I am deeply sorry. My son didn't interrupt her. When she finished, he looked at me with tears in his eyes. I failed you, he admitted, not because I believed the agreement was right, but because I never questioned it. You spent your whole life protecting me, and when it was my turn to protect you, I stayed quiet. Dad would have expected more from me, and so should you. He reached into his pocket and placed the envelope on the coffee table. Inside was every dollar they had planned to charge me for rent. Tucked beside it was a handwritten note that simply read, "This was never yours to pay." I gently pushed the envelope back toward them. "Keep it," I said. "This has never been about money." We sat together for a while without speaking. The silence no longer felt cold. It felt honest. Finally, I looked at both of them and said, "If we're going to be a family again, things have to change. No more decisions about this house without me. No more treating kindness as permission. And no more forgetting that respect comes before comfort." They both nodded without hesitation. Neither of them tried to negotiate. Neither of them defended what had happened. They simply accepted every word. A month later, they moved into a small apartment of their own. This time, they didn't leave because I asked them to. They left because they finally understood that building an independent life was part of becoming responsible adults. Our relationship didn't heal overnight. Trust rarely does. But little by little, they earned it back through quiet actions instead of promises. The following Christmas, I woke up before sunrise, just as I had every year for decades. As I walked into the dining room, I smiled. My chair was exactly where it had always been. Beside it sat my husband's empty chair, waiting quietly as it always had. A little while later, the front door opened and my family began arriving. My daughter-in-law stepped inside carrying dessert. She paused beside the dining table, smiled gently, and asked, "Margaret, where would you like everything this year?" It was such a simple question. A year earlier, she would have answered it herself. Now she waited for me. I smiled and pointed toward the kitchen, right where they've always gone. Without another word, she carried every dish exactly where I asked. As laughter slowly filled the house again, I realized something my husband had understood long before I did. A home is never protected by locks alone. It's protected by the respect people bring with them every time they walk through the front door. And at that moment, for the first time in a very long while, my house finally felt like home again.